All right, good evening, everyone. Good morning, or good afternoon, wherever time you want to watch this. My name's Shane Fisher, and I am a member of the Lord's Church, and I have with me a good friend of mine named David Key. David, say hello to you. Say hello.
Well, hello, everybody. This is David Key from Henderson, Tennessee area. Maybe some of you know of the Freed-Hardeman University area. That's kind of basically where I live.
Yeah, David and I have known each other for many years. And basically, what we want to talk about is the date and prophecies of Daniel today. And it's going to be part one of we don't know how many parts there are going to be because we talk a long time. So anyways, but David has written a book, and it's called Daniel the Apologetic Prophet. And I actually finished it a few days ago, and I thought it was a great book. I thought he writes in such a way that, you wrote it for a popular audience, right?
I did. I could have gone into a lot more detail, really, than I did in the book. But there's so much there and I wanted it to be accessible, to the average person, who doesn't have like some doctor or whatever,
Mm-hmm. So how can people get a hold of your book, David?
You can go to Yeoman Press. I believe. Let's see. Trying to see what the exact web address is. Basically, you can just Google Yeoman Press, Yeomen Press is Press. Just Google that, and the guy who runs that, his name is Roger Erickson, and he's my publisher. And so you could buy a copy directly from him, or you could just email me, and I'll be happy to sell you a copy directly myself.
Do you want to go ahead and give your email address?
Sure, it's David Key. That's DavidKea, all lowercase, 312 at gmail.com. So David Key 312 at gmail.com.
Okay. So like we said, we're going to talk about the date and prophecies of Daniel. And this is a very important subject for several reasons. So I want to ask David, why should we study this subject, David?
Studying Daniel and the prophecies. Well, if Daniel is a true prophet of God, that is, if he wrote prophecies that only God could have revealed, then God exists, and we have to take the religion of Daniel seriously. We have to take the Judeo-Christian religion seriously. And so Daniel really is, in my opinion, one of the most important pieces of evidence for the Christian religion. If it's not true, then we're wasting our time. We should all just maybe, as Paul said, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But exactly. But if it is true, Jesus rose from the dead, and if Daniel is a true prophet of God and God revealed the religion to the Jews and to ultimately to Christians, the one true religion, then we need to take that religion seriously, because souls are at stake, and so that's really the bottom line. And of course, in our culture, we've seen Christianity as a religion has been waning in our culture, I think, especially among young people.
You talk about that in the front of your book a little bit.
Yes. Unbelief is really growing in America. There's a church statistician by the name of Flavel Yeakley, who got some really scary statistics. Basically, among churches of Christ, something like 40% of young people are leaving the churches of Christ. 40%, and half of that number is leaving the churches of Christ and is not associated with any religion whatsoever. And so that is a scary thought. Not only are they leaving the church, the one true church, but they're leaving even false views of Christianity. They're going into atheism or agnosticism, unbelief in general, or not knowing what to believe. And so that's very scary.
Yeah, you and I were growing up. I went to the public school system, so I learned about the theory of evolution and stuff of that nature. And there was a time in my life where I thought that evolution and creation could be compatible.
Right.
And it's not really until Apologetics Press came when I was about 11, 10 or 11 years old, and started giving historical evidence about the coexistence of dinosaurs and humans, and talking
Right.
about also for the global flood. I mean, there's a lot of evidence in geology and stuff of that nature, and why the dinosaurs, there's fossils of dinosaurs and stuff of that nature. And it started to click. I finally, I made the connections. And
Right.
so that's where my faith actually grew. Um, and I wondered, if I had not had learned that evidence for Christianity, then where would I be today? And so, what we're trying to accomplish in this lesson for today and the rest of our series is we're just giving one of the reasons why we believe Christianity is true, and that is the book of Daniel, and why he gave prophecies that actually came to pass uh,
Yes.
long after he died. So.
Yes. One of the main reasons why I'm a Christian really is the Book of Daniel. When I was in college, I went through a period of, I wouldn't say like unbelief per se, but just kind of backing off a little bit, wanting to say, really, is this true? And uh, I had one of my best friends in college actually became an agnostic atheist, basically. And he was a Bible major, and I thought, well, how could a Bible major become that way? And so it kind of made me step back, and so I had to really dig in and look at some of the evidence for Christianity. And one of the main pieces of evidence that really convinced me, once I dug into it, is the Book of Daniel itself.
So, like we say, each Christian needs to be a defender of the faith, not just me and David, but everyone who's a Christian. Philippians 1:17 says, knowing that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel. 1 Peter 3:15 says that we're to give an answer for the reason of the hope that is within us with meekness and fear. And so we're to tell people, why are you a Christian? And you should be able to give some reasons why you do believe it to be true. So I'm asking the question, would you be able to defend why you believe what you believe? And I hope that maybe after you take this series, you will be able to defend the inspiration of the Bible, and knowing that the God of the Bible exists. So let's ask this question, David. What do people usually know about the book of Daniel?
Yes.
What comes to your mind?
Uh, yeah, amazingly, even members of the church who should really know more than they do, they know they know the history section of Daniel. They know about Daniel in the lion's den. They know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego
Yeah,
in
they
the
know the
fiery
Babylonian
furnace.
names, not the Hebrew names.
Yes, which exactly, which is really funny to me. I guess it's because it's easier to remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego instead of the names you have there on the screen there, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And I'm probably butchering those names. But um, yeah, those are the stories that we learn in Sunday school as children. And so most of our knowledge of Daniel, unfortunately, is what we've learned, when we were, say, from the ages of 3 to 8 years old, and then after that, it's like past chapter 6, it's like, what? I don't know anything.
Right.
And then as adults, you rarely have classes that really dig deep into the prophetic section of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12. About the only prophecy that members of the church uh, are somewhat familiar with, maybe, would be the prophecy in Daniel chapter 2. The dream of Nebuchadnezzar there.
Right.
They kind of know that prophecy, and which is good, and it's a good start. In fact, to understand the rest of the prophecies, you really kind of have to understand that prophecy, and so it's a good starting point, and it's a good springboard into Daniel studies. But unfortunately, many members of the church stop there.
Yeah, and it's also unfortunate, and we're not going to get on a rabbit trail about this, but a lot of the denominations believe in premillennialism, and they have
Yeah.
such a weird view of Daniel 8 and or Daniel 11 and Daniel 12, and they think it's referring to the Antichrist and all this
Yes.
stuff. And
I,
it saddens me that there's not a lot of people that give the true interpretation to these prophecies as we ought to. So.
yeah, and it's kind of, after the Reformation movement, it's the focus has been on like premillennialism, really.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, that has clouded that worldview or that interpretation of end times. When looking at the Bible, it's not just the Book of Daniel; it's the whole Bible. They interpret end times through premillennialism. We could talk more about what that is. There's lots of different versions of it, but unfortunately, they read Daniel through the lens of premillennialism, and
Mm-hmm.
that's unfortunate. Instead of allowing Daniel form their worldview about the end times, they forced Daniel to fit their own preconceived worldview of end times,
Mm-hmm.
premillennialism.
Yeah. So what we want to talk about in this series, and we probably are going to only be talking about the date today, but these are some of the prophecies that are found in Book of Daniel. We already discussed chapter 2, which discusses the forthcoming. Well, Daniel's already living in the first kingdom, which is Babylon, but there's going to be 3 that rise up, which is Medo-Persia, the Greeks, and the Romans. And that's what that's discussing. And in chapter 7 discusses the same thing, just uses animals. And then chapter
Yeah.
8 is about the conquest of Alexander the Great, how he conquers Darius III, the Persian king. And it also talks
Yeah.
about Antiochus Epiphanes. And then chapter 9 is really amazing, talking about that 70 weeks prophecy, which we will get at some point into more detail. And then I love chapter
Yeah.
11.
Yeah.
Is chapter 11 your favorite out of these prophecies, or which one's your favorite out of these chapters?
Boy,
it's
that
hard to pick.
changes from day to day. Yeah, because the more I get into the prophecies, the more amazed I am at them. And so that changes from time to time. I guess overall, my favorite would have to be the 70 weeks prophecy in chapter 9, because there's 4 verses that are prophetic, and yet those 4 verses are so loaded with 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 prophecy, it's not even funny. It's amazing. And then when you look at how Jesus and the church and the destruction of Jerusalem, those things that can be established outside of the Bible. We know that Jesus lived. We know that he died by crucifixion. We know that Jerusalem was destroyed, some 40 years after his death. And that's documented outside of the Bible, and yet Daniel is predicting it here, even with, and what's amazing is even with a late date, if the liberal critics are right, this prophecy still predates the Roman Empire.
Right. Yeah, I know.
So they're really in a pickle. The liberal critics are really in a pickle, and of course they have their ways of trying to explain it all away. We can get into that, but yeah, Daniel is one of the best prophecy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for me, one of my favorites is Daniel 11, talking about the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and then chapter 12, the general resurrection of, and of course we'll talk more about these. So what we're trying to show, friends, is okay. What does Daniel say? If we're really reading Daniel as we should, then we should come away with the early date, as we will call it. And we're going to show you reasons why we believe in the early date is because of just what the text itself says. But there are various reasons why we even believe, besides what the text says, on why we should believe in the early date of Daniel. And so, but this is something we have to establish because we have, so when it comes to why we believe the Bible is the Word of God, one of my main reasons is predictive prophecy. And with predictive prophecy, you got 3 things. You got to have, of course, you got to have the timing. You got to have, so then you got to have specific details but then you got to have the fulfillment. But so if somebody says, well, as the liberal critics do, they'll say, well, Daniel was written after the fact. It was written, after these things came to pass. Then, that kind of blows against the argument for the inspiration of Scripture. So if we can establish that there is actually that it was written in the early date, then our case actually is strong. You agree with that?
Yes. Yes. And I think because we can tell that this is true because the liberal critics try their best to establish a later date for Daniel. If it didn't matter, they wouldn't worry about trying to get a later date.
Right. So let's just go through the text of Daniel real quick and show people why we believe in the early dates. So first you'll remember that Judah is a southern kingdom. They have rebelled against God, and God is finally going to judge them by using the Babylonians. So we find that Nebuchadnezzar actually had 3 deportations, and Daniel is found among the first deportation, which occurred around 606, 605 BC, somewhere around that time. Would you like to read that text for us, David?
Sure. Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. So we have, now in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king.
Okay, so here we're already in chapter 2, and it's the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So Daniel had already been there in Babylon for some time. And so we can actually, through archaeology and historical records, we can establish the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign was around 603 BC. That's when that was. Somewhere in that nature. I mean, we can go 604, 602, but it's somewhere in that neighborhood.
Exactly. When you're talking about dates in the Old Testament, because it could be a year or 2 off, but that's not really a big deal. It's still in the 6th century BC.
Okay, so moving on, this is another king of Babylon, which was Belshazzar, which we'll talk more about in just a moment. But it says in Daniel 5:30 that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. Well, we know that his last year would have been 539 BC because that's when Cyrus came and conquered Babylon. So
exactly,
we can be pretty confident about that date. All right, Daniel 7 verse 1.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate any further on that, or keep going?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I mean, we've got lots of archaeological evidence, and really liberal critics don't really debate like the fact that Cyrus, conquered Babylon in 539 BC or thereabouts. So, it could be off 1 or 2 years or whatever, but that's not really that big of a deal. We know it's around that time period. Yeah.
All right, Daniel 7:1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed, which talks about those animals of the 4 kingdoms. So first year of Belshazzar would have been 553 BC. And so that's
I've seen it at 555 BC, and I've seen it at 553. So I think 553 is probably the closest. Yeah.
Okay. You want to read this one?
Sure. Daniel chapter 8 verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time.
In which he's going to show the prophecy of the male goat and the ram, which we talk about Alexander the Great and conquering the Persian Empire.
Yes.
So the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar would be 551-ish, in that neighborhood.
Yes.
Okay. Go a little bit further. So Daniel 9:1, in the 1st year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. So this is where we're going to get into the 70 weeks prophecy. So that would have been around 539-ish, somewhere in that neighborhood. Now,
yeah, seen it at 537, 538 or 539. So it's right around that neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's just go a little bit further. Daniel 11, verse 1. You want to read that one?
Sure. Daniel 11, verse 1. Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen him.
In which he's going to give the prophecy of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Basically, there is, some debate over who Darius the Mede was. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, even among conservative scholars, we don't know exactly who Darius the Mede is, or at least you'll have a debate about who exactly he is. We know that he's associated with the Medo-Persian Empire and the transition from Babylon into the Medes and the Persians. So even though we don't know exactly who he is, we know kind of the time period when Daniel receives this prophecy. Liberal critics will try to accuse Daniel of being a bad historian because they'll say that he's making up a character, but that's a logical fallacy.
It's called denying the antecedent.
Yes, exactly. It's a logical fallacy, and it's also among historians we call it the argument from silence. Which, ironically to me, it's not really an argument from silence because the Bible is not silent on it. The Bible itself is a piece of historical literature, and so we do have evidence of Darius the Mede just by the very fact that Daniel mentions it. Now, you can question that evidence, but to say that the historical evidence is silent on it is false. What they really mean to say is that secular history is silent concerning Darius the Mede. But that begs the question. It assumes that Bible history is wrong and secular history is right, but that's not necessarily true. So it's really just an argument from silence, which there's lots of examples where this argument just fails miserably. So
yeah, I mean, there was a time when people thought the Hittites didn't exist, and
yes.
lo and behold, what do we find? We find archaeology that the Hittites did exist, and same thing with Belshazzar. Same thing with Pontius Pilate. I mean, we can go on and give more examples, but that's this logical fallacy. It keeps on rearing its ugly head. So
yes. Now we need to be clear here. Sometimes we might not know everything about history. That doesn't mean that Daniel didn't know what he was talking about. And to me, it's funny how a liberal critic who's living, over 2,000, almost 2,500 years after the fact, is a better historian, claiming to be a better historian than Daniel. And I think that's just quite frankly absurd. But anyway.
So one of the first recorded people that we know of that actually went against the book of Daniel was Porphyry, who I believe lived in the 3rd century AD, if I remember right.
I think you're correct. Yes.
And he's the one that kind of was like, okay, Daniel was very specific in his prophecies here. Well, he must have written it after the fact. Some unknown writer wrote it, actually.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, he's the first person that we have recorded who basically accused Daniel of writing his prophecies after the fact.
So, like we say, friends, if you're just looking at the text itself, you can see that, I mean, it goes with what we call the early date. Because we know Daniel lived for a long time. He lived to be over close to 90 years of age. So we know that he lived in this lifespan of time here from 606. Of course, he was we don't know how old he was, but he was most likely a teenager to a young man. But we know he lived for a very long time because he even lived even in the Persian Empire when they came along. So
exactly.
So that's one of the reasons why we believe in the early date. But there are people out there like who have followed in the footsteps of Porphyry, who will say that oh no, there's an unknown writer in Palestine who wrote all this stuff down after the fact, and they wrote it down after Antiochus Epiphanes, because Antiochus Epiphanes is talked about so clearly in these prophecies, so that's why they must go along with what we call the late date.
Yes, basically the only reason why they're making these accusations against Daniel is because it doesn't agree with their view of reality. If they don't accept the supernatural, if they accepted the supernatural, there is no evidence against that shows Daniel wrote later than the 6th century.
Mm-hmm.
Really.
All right. So but sometimes people don't understand. Sometimes people don't realize the implications if they do take the late date, and that would be that Jesus was a liar, because Matthew 24:15 says, therefore, and he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, saying in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Here we have Jesus saying Daniel was a prophet of God.
Yep, and not only was he a prophet of God, he's actually saying Daniel wrote that book, not somebody later pretending to be Daniel. So
right. And then, the second implication is that this so-called Daniel was a liar too, because he claimed, he's. I one time was looking at Daniel 11 and just looking at all the future tense verbs, and he will do this and he will do that, and it's just interesting to me. Like, okay, if this is written after the fact, then you're having somebody who's acting like he wrote it for the future, but he's actually writing it after the fact, which makes him, kind of dishonest.
Yeah, and not only this is a problem not only for this is a problem for Christians who claim there's some Christians who actually will argue that Daniel is writing after the fact, but it's kind of like they don't really understand the implications of what they're saying when they say that, because it's like, well, you're saying that Daniel really wasn't a prophet, that he was in fact a liar, and so that's got some major implications if you're a Christian and you hold to the late date.
Mm-hmm. And the third implication is that the Bible's telling lies, and so you either believe the Bible is lying or it is the truth, and so.
Yeah, there's really two camps. Really, the book of Daniel really divides it up into two camps. You're either with the Bible or you believe the Bible is just bogus.
All right, implications of the early date would be that Jesus was a true prophet of God. Daniel also was a true prophet of God, shows the inspiration of the Bible, and it actually proves the existence of God. It's one of the things, one of the arguments that Brother Warren used, and I think it stands, valid and sound, is that if the Bible shows itself to be beyond be beyond human production, then it is the word of God. The Bible does show itself to be beyond human production, in which we could use specifically predictive prophecy, and we're gonna establish that argument as valid and sound, and show God, who knows the future, he knows everything. He can give the details of those events to his spokesperson, which would be Daniel in this case, and which it would show Daniel that he is speaking truthfully about events that will occur in the future, only because God showed it to him, and so it shows the existence of God. So,
yeah, to me, prophecy, we often think of it as a miracle of knowledge, or like foreknowledge, like a prediction. Really, to me, prophecy shows not just that God can predict the future; it's that God ultimately is in control. Even despite human free will, God still is in control. He raises up kingdoms, he brings kingdoms down. That's a major point of the book of Daniel, and which to me is even more powerful than just simply, being like a fortune teller or something like that.
Right. That's a good point. All right, so we're going to go through some points of evidence here why we believe, besides just the text itself laying out the early date, there's actually evidence beyond that. So our first point is going to be Belshazzar. And what's interesting is okay, so, well, I'll look in a moment, but basically before the 1880s and 1850s, actually, so before the 1850s, Belshazzar was not known. We just didn't know about him, and we actually have Herodotus, we have Xenophon, who were Greek historians, and they wrote down all this information about certain kings and so forth, and even wrote about the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus, but they don't mention any Belshazzar. And so we find that skeptics of the Bible before that time were arguing and saying, well, see, the Bible is false because there was no such king as Belshazzar and so forth, which once
Yeah.
again is the argument from silence, which we already discussed previously. And so what we find is archaeology helps us out. And we actually find that the Nabonidus Chronicle, it was published in 1882 by Pinchas. And it talks about how Nabonidus was this king of Babylon who was at Tema in Arabia campaigning. So he's down there for a while in Arabia. He's away from Babylon. Well, who takes over Babylon? Well, who's going to take over the kingdom? Well, we find out there's another artifact that was found, the Nabonidus cylinder from Ur, discovered in 1854. And it talks about how Nabonidus was repairing 3 temples. And very interesting enough, it says this on the cylinder. Would you like to read that for us?
Sure. It says, "As for me, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, save me from sinning against your great Godhead, and grant me as a present a life of long days. And as for Belshazzar, the eldest son, my offspring, instill reverence for your great Godhead, his heart, and may he not commit any cultic mistake. May he be sated with a life of plenitude."
Okay. So right there, Belshazzar was a true person.
And this is a piece of archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
The Nabonidus cylinder. So we see that Nabonidus and Belshazzar, they jointly reigned. They were the last 2 kings of Babylon.
Mm-hmm. So we recognize he was made a co-regent with his father, just like you were saying.
Yep.
And what's really interesting is when you read Daniel 5. So what's interesting is Nabonidus is not even mentioned, which verifies the Bible is true because Nabonidus was down in Arabia campaigning.
Exactly.
So very interesting enough, he sees this handwriting on the wall and he wants to know what it means, and he's going to give some rewards for anyone who gives the true interpretation of it. And if we could, let's just read verse 16. Would you mind just reading verse 16?
Sure. It says, "And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom." So this is being addressed to Daniel.
Yeah. And being made 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Okay, yep. So why would he need? All right, let's think logically about this, David. Why would he need to be made 3rd ruler of the kingdom? I mean, why can't he be made 2nd ruler?
Exactly. It kind of implies that maybe there was another king besides Belshazzar here, which is exactly what we find in the Nabonidus cylinder. So it perfectly corroborates what Daniel is saying here in very specific detail, and this is, like you were saying, this is a very nuanced way that Daniel is, recording history here. This is very specific, very intricate.
So we want to ask this question to those who believe in the late date, or even to those who don't even believe in the Bible. How would the late date writer have known about Belshazzar if he had been lost through history?
Exactly.
I mean, Xenophon didn't write about him, Herodotus didn't write about him, but yet they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have Wikipedia.
That's a good point. It's like we just take for granted. We can, if we have a question about history, we can just Google it. The Almighty God of Google knows everything. That's the way we almost view it. But they didn't have that kind of technology back then to know the intricacies of the Babylonian Empire prior to its fall. Would have taken I'm not even sure if they could have known it, other than, as far as archaeology, because some of this stuff is archaeological stuff that's been found, after the fall of Babylon. So, it's at the very least, it would have required a lot of effort and energy to get all this stuff right if you were writing in the second or third century. And the
So,
fact, yeah.
well, I was just say this is a strong date for the early date because of the details here given in Daniel 5. And how would someone know about this unless they were already living in Babylon and in the early 6th, 5th century?
Exactly. The best explanation is that Daniel was there and he wrote his. Yeah,
Right.
that he was there and he got his prophecies in the 6th century.
All right. Another piece of evidence is the plastered walls. So this goes along with the Belshazzar account. So it says when they're having this Babylonian banquet, it says, in the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. Now, that's a very specific detail. So here's the thing, friends. The writer had detailed knowledge of the room where the handwriting on the wall appeared. And we don't have archaeological evidence that plaster was used in buildings of Palestine in the 2nd century BC. So how is it the case that the Babylon? How did this person know, about this detail, unless he was there? That fits better with the evidence that it was actually Daniel who lived in the 6th and 5th century BC rather than someone in the 2nd century BC in Palestine.
Yes. There's lots of little details like this that, if you've got one of them, it's like, well, okay. But when you start adding up these little details, it's like, you can create a cumulative case. It's like being stung by a mosquito 1,000 times, death by 1,000 mosquito bites, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. All right, here's a third piece of evidence is Alexander the Great and the ram. So we're going to talk about this. So I just want to mention that here's basically a map of the campaign of Alexander and how he conquered the known world at that time. So you can see him start from Macedonia and he goes through what we call modern day Turkey and proceeds down, and he even goes and marches through Israel, even going to Egypt. So here's the interesting thing. When he arrives in Egypt, he comes across what's called the Sawa Oasis or Ammonium. And here's a picture of that there. And he consulted the oracle of Ammon, and it was a Libyan god that had a ram's head on it. And Alexander was told that he was Ammon's son. Now here's the interesting thing. Here's a picture of that, of the Libyan god Ammon. You can see the horns on each side of his head, like a ram's horns. And here's a coin from Cyrene of that. Here's Alexander with the horn diadem by one of his generals called Lysimachus. As you can see here, you can see those ram's horns. So here's the thing. Here's a question I have for those people who believe in the late date. If Daniel was written late, would it have not depicted Alexander the Great as a ram because of all this historical evidence that we have of him as a ram? And the interesting thing is, when you go to Daniel 8, 3 through 7, you actually have it as the case where I won't read all of this, but basically it talks about a ram which had 2 horns. And it says the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him. And this is talking about the Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. But what's interesting, it talks about the male goat came from the west and trampled over this ram. And who is that ram, that male goat, David? Who's that representing?
That would be Alexander the Great.
Right. So, we have it as a case. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and if you read on into Daniel 8, we know that this imagery is talking about the Medes and the Persians and then the Grecian Empire, because Daniel tells us that's what it means later on in the prophecy.
Yeah, right. So I mean, so why would it be the case? I mean, if he's depicted as a ram and historical evidence is, the late date writer would have probably had, well, he might have had access to some information. We don't know exactly, but he would have rather had used the ram more than the male goat. So
that's a very good point. Yeah.
So it fits to me the early date better. Now that's not strong. That's not too strong of a piece of evidence, and I'm willing to admit that. But there's some other things. So like you say, we're building a cumulative case here, and we're going to have some stronger pieces
Yes.
here. So let's talk about the Aramaic of Daniel. Now, this is interesting about the book of Daniel. We have so we know that the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, except for two books, which is Ezra and we have Daniel. And Daniel, and we have it here, was written in two main languages. So we got Hebrew first in chapter 1, verse 1, going to chapter 2, verse 3. Then he decides to switch to Aramaic from chapter 2, verse 4 to 728. Then it returns back to Hebrew in chapter 8, verse 1 to the end of the book. Now, why is this the case? And scholars have tried to give answers to these questions. What are some of the reasons you've heard, David, on why this is done?
Well, the prophecies, I guess chapters 2 through 7, was written more, I think, brought not just the Hebrews, but also to the Gentiles.
Right.
So that could be it. Especially since chapters 2 and chapter 7 relate to the Roman Empire, and it would have more. I guess it would have more of an application to not just Babylon, but to the Gentiles in general.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know exactly, to be honest with you. I mean, we can debate why, but the fact is, it is chapters 2 through 7, as you it was written in Aramaic, and so the question is, does this put it in the 2nd century, as the liberal critics say, or is it, does it fit with the 6th century?
So one of the things we're going to talk about soon is the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the Aramaic of Daniel in those Dead Sea Scrolls, they don't agree with the Aramaic that was discovered in Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So,
yes,
with all these languages that, a language is going to evolve over time. We see this with Greek. Homer is a little bit different from the Koine Greek of the New Testament. It's a lot different, actually. So, Aramaic is the same way, and so is even Hebrew. And we have to find out, okay, when, at what sort of stage of evolution was this written in? And we actually have a pretty good idea of when the Aramaic was written, because of other secular documents.
There's something called the Elephantine Papyri that I believe Kenneth Kitchens, who's an Egyptologist, talks about, and he says that the Aramaic and that has to go back at least to like the 5th century, no later than like the 5th or 4th century BC. So it fits better with the early date.
Do you have a slide on that? You want to read that quote or?
Yeah. Let me see here if I can pull it up.
I'll stop sharing and whenever you're ready.
So I'll go ahead and hit share screen and see if I can't pull up. Oops.
Yeah. Okay, I stopped sharing my screen. So you should be able to share your screen now. Okay.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull it up. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm gonna go through some of this. Let's see. Let's talk about the language of Daniel here. This is kind of interesting. Kenneth Kitchens, he says that the Aramaic, it's not just Kenneth Kitchens, it's Kenneth Kitchens and Gleason Archer, if I remember correctly, Gleason Archer was a Hebrew scholar, and not just a Hebrew scholar, but
several languages.
I heard I guess it's kind of a legend now, but supposedly while he was taking classes, he would take notes in like I don't know, Hittite language or something like that. And I'm thinking that's pretty crazy when you're taking notes in just some random language.
Still there? Hello?
Scholars, and they say things like for instance, we were talking about the Aramaic, but let's talk about the Persian words. For instance, 4 of the 19 Persian words are not translated well by the Greek renderings of about 100 BC because their meaning was lost or drastically changed by the time of the 2nd century, by the time of 165 BC. So how do we explain that Daniel got these Persian words translated right when someone writing from 165 BC he wouldn't have known? And so that's one thing there, the Persian words, and of course you've got the Greek. There's 3 Greek words. Sorry.
Well, let's say it this way, so because our audience may not know this, but so go back to one side. Yeah, so stay on that side. So what we want to say about this, friends, is that go back, go back to that other slide.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so what we're trying to say, friends, is sometimes the late daters will bring forth some arguments like these Persian words, and it seems like there is evidence for the late date at first, but you got to do a little bit more digging. So when you think about these Persian words, in which are actually old Persian words, is what we learned, then it really doesn't help their case because, like you just talked about, I mean, that these were administrative words, and like you said, they're not translated well by the Greek renderings of about 100 BC. So
yeah, by 165 BC, that's when Daniel was writing. A lot of these words they couldn't have been translated very well by the Greek, but Daniel he knew how to use these words, so he was knowledgeable of them. So that implies that he must have been living, earlier when these words were in use.
And the same thing. So go ahead and go to the next slide about the Greek words. So see, the late daters will also use these. There's 3 Greek words. Is it like 3 Greek words? They're all instruments.
Yeah, and they're all musical instruments. There's 3 of them, and so they'll say, well, see, these are Greek words, and so this fits better with the 2nd century, because by that time, the Jews were influenced heavily by the Greek Empire, and so they'll argue it fits better with the later date, in the 2nd century.
But like well, I was just going to say, but like we were saying, friends, there's the evolution of the Greek language. I mean, from Homer. I mean, Homer lived like in 800 BC or somewhere around there. So, Greek has been around for a while, and so it would have been circulated, so to speak, in these areas. And so that's why we have known such these words. But go ahead. Keep going.
Yes. Yeah, and so we have, like you were saying earlier, at these Aramaic documents. These are from the Elephantine papyri that have been discovered, and these have been dated to the 5th century BC, and these contain Greek words. And so this argument about these 3 Greek words doesn't prove anything. In fact, one could argue, if Daniel was written in the 2nd century when the Jews were heavily influenced by the Greeks, why doesn't it contain more Greek words? The very fact that it only contains 3, and these 3 Greek words are musical instruments. I'm thinking of in our own language, in English. What words, like for instance the guitar or the piano, well, those were brought over from another language into English. The piano and the guitar, I believe those are Spanish words, if I remember correctly. I don't know exactly. All I know is originally those words were brought over from another language. And so it's the same idea here. We would expect musical instruments to be transferred from one language to another language like this. Those would be the first words to transfer over.
Okay. Do you have any more slides on the language, or is that pretty much all?
Let's see. That's all. That's pretty much all I have on the language. Yeah. Let me. All I had on the language. So if you want to, you can go back to your slides. I think you've got more. You have more detail on your slides.
Okay, it should be sharing. Is it shared? It should be sharing. I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Can it be seen? Can it be seen?
Yeah, I'm trying to pull it up on mine.
I'll do it again.
Yes, I got it. I got
You did have it. Okay. Well, I'll do it again.
Oh yeah, gotta love
Okay.
technology.
Okay. So, like we were saying with this, in regards to Aramaic, this is what we call Imperial Aramaic, which does fit better with the early date rather than the late date, because there was another, I don't know how to say it, syntax was different with regards to the Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it
Yes.
so it just doesn't fit, friends. So that's something that we're
Yeah, like you were saying, language changes over time, and so they can look, these language scholars can look at these slight differences in the way the Aramaic of the 6th century and 5th century and the Aramaic of the second. And so they can look at the differences, and they're very slight and very, I guess, nuanced, but they're enough that they can say, yeah, this is from the 5th or 6th century and not the 2nd century.
Mhm. All right, let's talk about the Hebrew. So even the Hebrew of Daniel does not agree in syntax and style with the Dead Sea Scrolls, even in the secular documents of the 2nd century BC. So that's something that's very interesting. So we're just saying the same thing, friends, that there is an older Hebrew in Daniel, and that fits better with the early date rather than the late date, where there is a younger Hebrew. I guess you could call it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So,
Right.
all
And the
right.
Dead Sea
So,
Scrolls themselves are pretty amazing.
and we were just mentioning Daniel and the old Persian words, and what's interesting is, like I said, they're old Persian words, and they weren't used after about 300 BC. Well, the late date, that's that doesn't fit the late date. So, um,
Exactly.
and I
Exactly.
like what Justin Rogers had to say about this in his. You can find this on Apologetics Press and the Reason and Revelation magazine. It's called "The Date of Daniel Does It Matter?" And he says, Kitchen found that the Persian words in Daniel are specifically Old Persian words, and since the transition to the Middle Persian dialect occurred around 300 BC, we would expect an author in the 2nd century to use a much different form of the Persian language. In addition, about half of the 20 or so Persian terms driver isolated in Daniel are administrative, exactly the kind of language we would expect from an officer of the Persian court. And the Persian terms actually serve to support a 6th century date for Daniel. So I think he's right on.
Exactly. Yeah. He words it exactly better than both of us, I think.
Yeah. So,
Yep.
like we say about these old Persian words actually fitting better with the early date rather than the late date. All right, let's go on. The Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha is a list of Old Testament books. They're not part of the Old Testament canon. There's various reasons why that's the case. We're not going to get into that. But we know that they were written a long time after the Old Testament canon had been closed, which was Malachi. And one of those books that I actually like reading is called First Maccabees, and it's really good for the historical value that it contains with regards to even some of the prophecies of Daniel, which are fulfilled. It's
Exactly.
because it talks about Antiochus Epiphanes and stuff of that nature. So, do you want to add anything to that?
Uh, yeah, I think this is a very good point about the canon. The Jews are very careful not to include Maccabees, even though they, highly respected it as in terms of they valued it as history. They didn't include it in the canon. But why did they include Daniel? If Daniel was written at the same time as these books were, why did they accept Daniel and not some of these others? The Jews are very clear about when they believe the Old Testament canon ended, and so the Jews said that the canon ended, with Malachi and the Persian Empire, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so you either have to say that there was this grand, massive conspiracy among the Jews, or that there was some mass delusion by the Jews, if you're trying to argue for a late date for Daniel. Both
Mm-hmm.
of which just make no sense whatsoever. How in the world can you get away with a grand, massive conspiracy at a nationwide level? How could you even get away with that? I don't even see how that could happen.
And
That's like that's like people trying to say, there's conspiracies about the moon landing. How could that happen? I mean, how in the world could you even? That's kind of
pull
what
that
you're
off.
going to get into. Yeah, how would you pull that off? That's what you would get into. That's the same idea with Daniel and the canon.
Mm-hmm. And and Josephus is one of those pieces of evidence that we have for the Old Testament canon, in which he said it was in the time of Artaxerxes, which is around the time of Malachi, when Malachi was living. So that's one of the things we.
Exactly.
So, like we say, friends, we got the early date and we got the late date. So, and we know the Apocrypha was written after even written after the late date. Um, and here's an interesting thing we actually find in First Maccabees, and this is talking about. So there was these Maccabees. They were known for going against Antiochus Epiphanes because they want to be faithful to the law of Moses, and unfortunately, the Greek culture was keeping them from obeying God. And I actually really like this, speech that he gives. I think it's actually pretty interesting, talking about kind of like a false uh, Hall of Fame of faith from Hebrews, so to speak. Um,
Yes.
so, do you want to read that? Would you like to read that for us?
You want me to read the whole thing?
Uh, yeah, just for context, I guess. Um,
Okay. All right. It says, "Now when the time drew near that Mattathias should die, he said unto his sons, Now hath pride and rebuke gotten strength in the time of destruction and the wrath of indignation. Now therefore, my sons, be ye zealous for the law, and give your lives for the covenant of your fathers. Call to remembrance what acts our fathers did in their name, so shall ye receive great honor and an everlasting name. Was not Abraham found faithful in temptation, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness? Joseph, in the time of his distress, kept the commandment and was made Lord of Egypt. Phineas, our father,
Finney
in being
has.
zealous, yeah,
Yeah, this is the
yeah,
King James
our father.
language.
Oh yeah. So yeah, Phinehas, our father, in being zealous and fervent, obtained the covenant of an everlasting priesthood. And Jesus or Joshua, that's the Greek form of Joshua. Talking about Joshua, for fulfilling the word was made a judge in Israel.
And then these here.
Caleb, for bearing witness before the congregation, received the heritage of the land. David, for being merciful, possessed the throne of an everlasting kingdom. Elias, for being zealous and fervent for the law, was taken up into heaven. Ananias, Azarias, and Mishael, by believing, were saved out of the flame. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they have reference to here to Daniel. Daniel, for his innocence, was delivered from the mouth of lions.
So, what's interesting about this is look at what Matthias appeals to, all these heroes of faith, we could call them. And he even mentions Daniel's three friends, mentions Daniel himself as a
His,
person to look up to.
and these were
And
real
so,
historical figures, according to the
right.
writer of Maccabees.
And the fact that Daniel was actually known. I mean, he's assuming that his sons know about these people. You remember these guys? You remember these guys? I mean, so if this was a late date, I mean that would have been. I mean, Daniel would have had to been known very quickly
He would
among.
have he would have yeah, he would have been a contemporary of the writer of First Maccabees.
Yeah, I
If
mean,
the late date
so
is
knowledge of that had to have to spread quickly among those people, Jewish people.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
Maccabees. So yeah,
it really fits better, I believe, with the early date than a late date. About these people were known, they had to become known over time and disseminated
ex- ex-
among the Jewish people. So,
exactly. Yeah, these were
like I
well
say,
known to the Jews. Yes,
I was gonna say they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have these fast forms of
very
communication like we do today.
very good Very good point. Very good point. I think it's called literary diffusion. You'd have to give it time for these manuscripts and the history itself to circulate and be established among the people. Because, like you said, there was no Google, there was no Skype, there was none of this.
Mm-hmm. All right, next thing is Daniel and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we kind of already been talking about, but we got the Dead Sea Scrolls are amazing for a lot of things, and it was discovered in 1947. I've had the privilege of actually seeing some of these caves from that vantage point,
Ah,
so it was pretty amazing. And they're still finding stuff, which is what's interesting. They've like the last two
yep.
years they found something in a cave, and I found it interesting. It took them over 70 years to find something else, but
Yeah, there's a wealth of information that they had to go through.
and so it answers the question in regards to the Old Testament. Anyways, was the Old Testament transmitted correctly? And prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest complete Old Testament was around 900 to 1000 A.D. And it was the Nash Papyrus is the oldest Old Testament papyrus from 150 to 100 BC that we have. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls date from 200 to 50 AD. That's the range that people give. Well, guess what book we found among the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, we found the book of Daniel. And they found portions of
Yeah.
these. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that. Yeah, from my research, I think every chapter, all 12 chapters that have been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least parts of them, and so it's not like it's just one little fragment. It's it's the entire book pretty much.
Mm-hmm. So, Brother Justin Rogers said this. He says Daniel is a popular character also at Qumran, with fragments of two manuscripts of the book dating to the 2nd century BC. In total, 8 manuscripts of Daniel have turned up among the Sea Scrolls. In addition, some pseudo-Daniel compositions have emerged from authors who wish to imitate Daniel, along with imaginary compositions partially based on Daniel. So, like we've said before, there's Aramaic on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and like they say, I'm just going to read the bold parts here. It's found that 90% of Daniel's Aramaic vocabulary was used in documents from the 5th century or BC or earlier. So, uh,
Yes, yes,
so once again, what we're seeing here, friends, is the early date just keeps on the evidence just keeps on accumulating for that.
yeah.
Um,
The Dead Sea Scrolls virtually require the early date. Basically, um, the the same evidence found in the Dead Sea Scrolls of other Old Testament books have forced the liberal critics to extend their dates earlier, but they won't do it with Daniel because they don't believe in prophecy.
mhm. All right, let's talk about the LXX, or what we call the Septuagint, because of the legend surrounding 70 scholars, Jewish scholars in Alexandria, who translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And so, because Greek was beginning to be the known language at that time because of Alexander the Great and the spread of the Hellenistic culture. So that's why they translated the Old Testament into another language, because as you can see here, Alexander Greek culture spread very rapidly wherever he conquered. This is
Oh
kind of
yeah,
the area that he took. So we see, well, it was translated during the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus II, and it was probably translated. It took a while for it to be translated, even after his reign. So I'm not saying that it took 40 years to translate all of the Old Testament. We don't know exactly, but we do know what book also is found in the Septuagint, and that is Daniel. And so I kind of ask people, well, how could the Septuagint Daniel be translated before it was written? Of course, we don't know exactly when it was translated into Greek, and that is that's it's not as strong as a piece of evidence as we might like, but it had to have been in Alexandria at this time, at least. The Book of Daniel. Um,
Yeah,
so
yeah, it's
I'll give to it that we don't know exactly when it was translated, but we know that it had to have been written in Hebrew first, and then in Aramaic, and then translated into Greek. So that's one thing that we
yes, yes,
so. So that we got that, but then we got Daniel and Josephus. So this is very interesting. This is one I think is very interesting. So Josephus is known for, I mean, I've never have read all of Josephus, and I don't ever plan to because there's just so much information. But there is a lot of good, rich nuggets of of things that are found, and I do suggest people read that for the sake of how there are some things that shed light on the New Testament, on a lot of the New Testament in some cases, especially with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and stuff of that nature in the Jewish-Roman War. But here, what's
yeah,
interesting is he's talking about some history of the Old Testament, and he talks about Alexander the Great's conquest. And so I'm just showing you a picture again of the conquest of Alexander the Great and what he did. And and what's interesting is when he acts, so he conquered Tyre, and then it talks about how, in a lot of the history books, it talks about how they went down to Gaza. Now, Josephus is the only one that gives this account here, and at first it seems like a legend. I'll give it, and there's a lot of people that say it was a legend, but there I believe the evidence shows that this was a true account, and I'm going to explain why in just a moment. So it says here in Antiquities 11.8.5, it says, when Alexander understood that he was not far from the city Jerusalem, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of the citizens. The procession was venerable, and the manner of it different from that of other nations. It reached to a place called Sapha, which name translated into Greek signifies a prospect, for you have thence a prospect both of Jerusalem and of the temple. And when the Phoenicians and the Chaldeans that followed him thought they should have liberty to plunder the city and torment the high priest to death, which the king's displeasure fairly promised them, notice this, the very reverse of it happened. For Alexander, when he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priest stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, having the golden plate whereon the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself and adored the name and first saluted the high priest. So what we see going on here is pretty much with every city that Alexander has conquered thus far, like Tyre, for example, they rebelled against Alexander, but he conquered them. And but when he got to Jerusalem, he didn't do that. He didn't conquer Jerusalem. He was actually kind of welcomed. And so it says, the Jews also did all together with one voice salute Alexander and encompass him about, whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done and supposed him disordered in his mind. However, Parmenio alone went up to him and asked him how it came to pass that when all others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews. To whom he replied, I did not adore him, but that God who hath honored him with his high priesthood. For I saw this very person in a dream in this very habit when I was at Dios in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me to make no delay, but boldly to pass over the sea thither, for that he would conduct my army and would give me the dominion over the Persians. Whence it is that, having seen no other in that habit, and now seeing this person in it and remembering that vision. So he's saying that God appeared to him in a vision on why he should conquer Persia. And it says, in the exhortation which I had in my dream, I believe that I bring this army under the divine conduct, and shall therewith conquer Darius and destroy the power of the Persians, and that all things will succeed according to what is in my own mind. And when he had said this to Parmenio, and had given the high priest his right hand, the priest ran along by him, and he came into the city, Jerusalem. And when he went up into the temple, he offered sacrifice to God, according to the high priest's direction, and magnificently treated both the high priest and the priest. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. And I found that very interesting, that the book of Daniel was actually showed to Alexander. Now, like we said, a lot of people will say, well, this is a legend. This was, written much later. But here's the thing. So we have Alexander appearing around 336 to 323 BC. That's his conquest of 13 years. So that's way before the late date. So that would support the early date. But here's the thing. So how do we know this is not some kind of myth or legend? Well, because elsewhere in the Bible, in the book of Zechariah, in which you can read this, and this is a prophecy concerning the conquest of Alexander and how he conquered these cities. Like, for example, it says, and against Tyre and Sidon, and which he did conquer them. Gaza was conquered by Alexander. So here's the interesting thing. So when we get to the next verse, I'm going to go ahead and just go a little bit further. Like we said, this is only found in Josephus's account. But, here's what God says. God says to Zechariah, I will camp around my house. Okay? God, why are you protecting your house? The temple. The temple was in Jerusalem. God, why are you protecting? Because of the army, because of him who passes by and him who returns. Well, when Alexander got to Jerusalem, he didn't conquer the city. God, in his providence, he protected the city. And no more shall an oppressor pass through them, for now I have seen with my eyes. And notice this, and this is what Jesus quotes in the New Testament. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion, shout, O daughter Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly, and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. Well, interesting enough, here we have a procession of Alexander being welcomed into the city of Jerusalem, and a Gentile king. But we have a greater prophecy of Jesus, who is the true king, being welcomed into Jerusalem, riding on the colt of a donkey, and we find that in Matthew.
It's worth
21.
It's worth noting that Alexander the Great died at basically the same age that Jesus died too.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting kind of like a type. Alexander the Great, I guess, is kind of a type of Christ. That's an interesting parallel. I don't know if I've ever noticed that parallel either, but
well,
thanks for bringing that out.
There's actually a good point. There's a poem called Alexander and Christ or something like that. It's worth reading for those of you who want to find that. I don't remember I don't remember who it was by, so I'm just thinking off the top of my head. But it's really good, and it talks about how both died at the age of 33, and it's just very interesting. So
yes, and Alexander the Great conquered the entire world empire in a very fast manner, and in a way, you can kind of say the same thing about Jesus. And ironically, he conquered the Roman Empire after his death.
And he didn't conquer by the sword, physical sword. He conquered by the sword of the Spirit.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. Very interesting stuff.
So, like we say here, this fits with the early date, talking about Josephus and what he talks about with regards to the book of Daniel. And I want to bring up Isaiah 44, 6 and 7. So it says, thus says the Lord, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first, I am the last. Besides me, there is no God who can proclaim as I do. And what he's doing here is he's talking about, the idols. How does God compete with the God of the Bible compete with the idols? Well, the idols, they can't say anything. They can't prophesy. They can't do anything. God can. God is able to predict the future because he knows everything. And so that's why he says, then let him declare it and set it in order for me, since I appointed the ancient people, and the things are coming and shall come. Let them show these to them. And Daniel does fulfill the true test of a prophet, because it says the question that Israel asks is, well, how shall we know the word of the Lord, which the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing does not happen or come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken presumptuously. You shall not be afraid of him. Well, all that Daniel has said did come to pass. It is true.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So how do you explain the entire Jewish nation accepting Daniel as a prophet when their own scriptures told them, you know what a true prophet is, and this is how you can know, you know?
And I would urge people, if they want, stop the video and read this. This is pretty long, so but Josephus talks about Daniel, and it's very interesting what he says. And I just want to get people to if you want to read it, it's in chapter 10.11.7 in Antiquities. So this one, he talks about the providence of God and and talks about Daniel being a true prophet. So and that's very interesting to me because here Daniel does predict the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That's something that's bad for the talk about for the Jews, and yet they would still accept it as he's a true prophet. That even though it's bad for them, what I'm saying. So I find that kind of
Oh
interesting.
yeah, there's a lot more with Josephus, and when we get into the prophecies about 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem, Josephus, he if you remember, I don't, we can get into the history of it all, but Vespasian and Titus, the two, Vespasian was the Roman emperor who destroyed Jerusalem, and his son Titus was the Roman general that destroyed Jerusalem. And Josephus basically believed Vespasian and Titus were fulfilling the prophet Daniel, the prophecy of Daniel, and which is really neat because he actually, according to Josephus, he showed Vespasian and Titus the prophecy, and that's one of the reasons why Vespasian and Titus decided to become the emperor, basically, because Rome was in a civil war, and the four generals of Nero were fighting over control over the Roman Empire, and Josephus believed Vespasian would become the Roman emperor before he actually became the Roman emperor because of Daniel.
Mm-hmm. So
Hey,
next time,
we can get into yeah. I was going to say
well,
we can get into that later when we talk about some of the prophecies, but Josephus is really an interesting witness for Daniel, and he's not a Christian,
right.
and so he's a really interesting witness for Daniel.
So next time, friends, when we come back, we're going to talk about specific prophecies of Daniel and really strengthen your faith in God that these prophecies did come true, and they are very detailed, and it's very interesting how they do come to pass. So we're very
Yes.
thankful that you joined with us. We hope that you'll stick around for part 2 and part 3 and whatever part we have to make. There's a lot to this, so we're very thankful that David came to be on with us, and I've certainly enjoyed it. So I'm gonna stop the recording and when we're gonna upload to YouTube. So y'all take care, okay? Thank you. If you want to
Thank
say anything
thank
else.
you, Shane.
Oh,
Yeah,
also,
I'm just going to
one
say
more thing. If you want to get a copy of David's book, Daniel the Apologetic Prophet, go to Yeoman Press, Yeomen Press. So, all right.
yep. Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you so much, Shane.
All right. Bye.
Take care.